So the recorded lecture for this evening is going to focus on the history of criticism and scholarship and what that means when we're reading and we're writing, especially about complicated ideas in film. When we're working with a specialized film class or a specialized class of any kind that is in the arts, especially queer cinema, where we're reading so much theory, our larger questions, and I touched upon this at the beginning of the term, comes from basically the history of philosophy and the intersection of philosophy into what we now understand as theoretical or critical reading. The way that we journey into this is that we go back to Germany, to the Enlightenment period, where Hegel, Heidegger, and Kant had different dialectics. In other words, kind of dialogues, right? Dialectic is one of those words. We're going to talk about privilege and language too. You see me smiling. So when I make myself laugh, you know, I'm not taking myself seriously. There's a dialectic, an exchange of discourse that existed within this period where the struggle, not quite the struggle, I would say the understanding of epistemology and ontology were crystallized and exchanged. These would have become very important as we'll move through in a bit, and as I'll show you, what these ways of thinking ask for is an understanding of the self and the self-experience in response to essence. Who am I? What descriptors might I use? Versus the acquisition of knowledge, right? So ontology versus epistemology, the acquisition of knowledge. And this is what Yves Cedric writes about rather extensively in Epistemology of the Closet, making the overall assumption that there is a body of knowledge we can gather from what we might understand as closeted, repressed, or not necessarily merit-worthy, which is really wrong, queer experiences. From this period, our next kind of exchange is the advent of psychoanalysis and Freud, who started to write, I guess, not quite 100 years later, but by the end of the century, and his work was translated into English in 1920. And Freud's understanding is almost as if, well, we can philosophically romanticize, right, the Enlightenment. We can romanticize about notions about what we think we might be or how we might understand ourselves. But how do we historically understand ourselves? And Freud has a series of theories that base this by going back to classical Greece and looking at the way that the Oedipal cycle plays itself out in the formation of sexuality in adults and sexual behavior. Queer theory uses psychoanalysis, and I'll get to which kind of psychoanalysis, as a way to ground the way that we might think about where we come from, for lack of better ideas. What causalities might cause us to not be straight? As we all know, these reductive methods of thinking are almost, they create a kind of injury to the process. We are who we are, and all of us in this class are different versions of what might fall under a particular umbrella or not. Freud's writing is important because it looks at childhood and childhood identifications and understandings of both parents and the way the child, i.e. the subject, what we later understand as subjectivity, according to Kaya Silverman, who we did last class, to the subject in response to his, her, or their understanding of their parents. There's complicated structures that exist in psychoanalysis that ideally a straight male child would rival the father for the affections of the mother, according to the psychoanalytic and Oedipal frame. A gay male child would do the reverse. A lesbian child would do what the straight male child would do, according to these theories, right? So I'm sharing with you according to, that doesn't mean I would say this is 150% correct. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What happens when children are bisexual or non-binary? How do they understand themselves within these paradigms? We notice that all of our theorists, right, from Judith Butler, who understands themselves as non-binary, to in part Eve Sedgwick, but moreover Kaya Silverman, who we studied last class, as I mentioned, there is a definite attempt to understand the sexual identifications of the subject matter they study. And we looked at Marcel Proux's work in response to Silverman last class. And what happens is a particular talk begins. There's a language that becomes, elitist is a hard term. There's a privilege with language that happens within university theory and writing at graduate level and moving on to publish. And what I notice is that theorists and thinkers who fall into larger categories of marginalized groups, and there's many, and queer thinkers are included in this, walk the walk and talk the talk. What does the talk do? The talk might win us grants because it shows how well read we might be, but are we bettering society or queer youth by doing these talks? These are rhetorical questions. When we move out of Freud in the early 20th century, the French had a series of thinkers who looked at linguistic structures. In other words, saying, okay, this is all fine and dandy, but how is language structured? And it was Lacan who took the writings of the French structuralists and thus understood Freud in more modern ways of being able to posit Freud's theories. And we studied Lacan at the beginning of the term, and Lacan gives us a language to understand signification opposed to symbolism, or signifying chains opposed to motifs. There's a power that comes from Lacan's psychoanalysis that allows us to semiotically have signposts that send us in particular directions, so that when we arrive, we understand the subject we might be looking at. Before Lacan wrote, philosophy was influenced very heavily by Jean-Paul Sartre and the French school of the time. L'enfer, c'est les autres, argue Sartre, that there is a damnation that happens, not necessarily in the pit of us, but within our contact with other people. And in response to looking at epistemology and ontology, Sartre suggested that we can understand ourselves in ways of thinking about what he coins as the en soi and the pour soi. And this duality of understanding is what I think in a lot of ways Lacan builds upon when he makes the suggestion of la différence entre langue and parole, that language and words are structured in a particular way, but what we understand as language and what we understand as words could have different meanings. So what does theory allow us to do? What does criticism allow us to do? It allows us to take apart our study, be it a cultural study or a piece of visual art or a film or a novel or a play or a poem, and construct a particular meaning that may or may not empower us as a critic, as an academic. Foucault suggests that this power comes because the knowledge that we acquire through the process is part of this power. And this is the important part of the Foucauldian mode, that there is the movement away from the psychoanalytic frame back to a more Sartrean understanding, but one that makes the suggestion that without knowledge, we can't become empowered beings. A curious side note, Foucault's sexual life was really psychoanalytic. So if you read about it, you'd be like, ooh, ooh. So it's interesting what he chose to reject and what he chose to embrace. When we read theory and criticism, and when we write for our courses, as we finish up our undergraduate degrees, and as we move into graduate school, are we expected to walk the walk and talk this talk? In part, Probably no. I would assume that if I were dealing with a student who sent me a proposal that I couldn't understand because it was so laden in circuitous language, I'd want the student to break it down more. But by reading theory, we train our mind. We get our mind to start picking apart things and looking at the engineering of a given film or the mathematical arrangements of a particular reading. And what we often read ends up reading like an equation of sorts. Those of you in film production who are very good editors probably have a very, very good creative and mathematical side to your brain, where you're able to splice and slice and reorganize in a very particular way to take the equation of what you might want to do and then restructure it into artistic product. Why is theory made so dense? Why is it alienating? I think it's the test. And I think on one level, those of us who can, as you can, digest, process, and write about these complicated subjects will be able to interact within the tough spaces of the academy, which expects us as students, scholars, professors, and lecturers to really be able to understand what we're looking at from very, very complicated positions. I hope this lecture helped. And yes, theory is alienating, but by being able to use it, reject parts of it, embrace other parts, we do have a chance to articulate our ideas on a level where we can work within the academy itself.